Millionaire single dad saw woman, beaten, her baby taken away. Then he buys ex-husband's house and gets her baby back. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, where children's laughter mingled with the soft rustle of leaves. Paul Blake sat on a bench near the playground, sipping his coffee while keeping an eye on his 6-year-old son Finn, who was gleefully chasing a soccer ball across the grass. Just as Paul turned to check his phone, a scream cut through the peaceful air. "No, please don't take her," a woman's voice cried out. Paul's head snapped up. Not far from the fountain, a woman with messy hair and tear-streaked cheeks was being pulled to the ground by a man in a dark suit. Clutched in the man's other arm was a little girl, no older than 4, crying and reaching back toward her mother. "Howard, stop! You can't do this!" the woman sobbed, trying to stand. The man shoved her back roughly. People watched from a distance but did nothing. Paul stood up quickly. "Hey!" he shouted, striding toward them. "That's enough!" The man turned, anger flashing in his eyes. "Stay out of this. It's a family matter." Paul pulled out his phone. "It looks like assault to me. Should I call the police?" The man hesitated, then hissed something at the woman before storming off with the child, who was still crying out, "Mommy! Mommy!" Paul knelt beside the woman, who was trembling on the grass. "Are you okay?" She looked at him with wide, panicked eyes. "They took her," she whispered. "They took my daughter." Paul helped her up gently. "Come on. Let's get you checked out." At the hospital, after the bruises on her wrist were tended to and the adrenaline had settled, she sat quietly beside him in the waiting room. Her name was Layla. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she said quietly. "You don't have to apologize," Paul replied. "That man, Howard, he was hurting you, and your daughter." She nodded slowly, then, as if releasing a floodgate, her voice broke. "He's my ex-husband, a councilman. Influential. After the divorce, he used everything he had, money, power, connections, to paint me as unstable. He had a fake psychiatric evaluation filed against me. I was forced into a facility for 6 weeks. By the time I got out, custody was gone." Paul stared at her, stunned. "That's criminal. He made it look clean, legal. I don't even have visitation rights. He claimed I'm a danger to Ava, but I'm not." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm her mother. She needs me." Paul's jaw clenched. "I believe you." Layla looked at him, uncertain. "You don't even know me." "I know what it feels like to fight for your kid," Paul said softly. "Finn's mother died in an accident. The courts didn't think a single dad could handle it. I had to prove myself, every step." Layla's face softened. "So you do understand." "More than you think," Paul replied. They sat in silence for a moment before he added, "Let me help you." Layla looked up, startled. "Why would you do that?" "Because no one else is, and because no child should be ripped away from someone who truly loves them." Layla wiped her eyes. "I just want to see her again, hold her, tell her I didn't leave her." Paul nodded. "We'll make sure she knows." And in that quiet hospital corridor, something shifted, not just sympathy, but a beginning, of justice, of healing, of something neither of them had expected when they woke up that morning. Under the dim evening light filtering through the guest house window, Layla sat curled on the edge of the sofa, clutching a warm cup of tea that Paul had made. She had barely spoken since they arrived, her arm still trembling from the events in the park. Paul stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her silently, before stepping in with gentle purpose. "You're safe here," he said quietly, setting down a blanket beside her. "My son Finn's asleep in the main house. No one knows you're here." Layla gave a faint nod, her lips pressed tightly together. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered after a pause. "You didn't even know me." "You didn't need to be known," Paul replied, his tone firm yet kind. "You needed help." They sat in silence for a while. The only sound was the wind brushing softly against the trees outside. Later that night, as the rain began to patter against the roof, Layla finally began to speak. Her voice was quiet but steady. "It started when I got pregnant," she said. "Howard was different then, charming, powerful. I thought I was safe. She gave a bitter laugh. He didn't want a daughter, wanted a son, said girls were weak. When Ava was born, he barely held her. Paul listened, his expression unreadable. He started isolating me, Layla continued, told friends I was unstable, stopped me from working. Then the pushing began. Then the bruises. When I tried to leave, he said no judge would believe me, and he was right. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn photo of a toddler girl with big brown eyes. Ava's all I had, and he took her. Said I was insane. Paul leaned forward slightly. How did he convince the court? He faked it, she said. Paid off a doctor. They diagnosed me with delusional disorder. One hearing, 20 minutes, and she was gone. Paul clenched his jaw. Do you know the doctor's name? Dr. Greaves, she said, her voice sharp with memory. He worked with Howard on some kind of health board project years ago. Paul made a mental note. The next morning, while Layla rested, Paul made a few quiet calls. As a venture capitalist and single father, he had long-standing relationships in both financial and legal circles. Within hours, he had confirmation. Dr. Peter Greaves had once been on the board of a hospital expansion project funded by Howard's campaign donations. Not only that, there had been whispers of misconduct, nothing proven, nothing formal. Paul leaned back in his chair, thinking. That afternoon, he returned to the guest house with a file in hand. Layla sat on the porch, sunlight catching her hair. I think you were right, he said, offering her the folder. This is just the beginning, but it's something. She opened the file and her eyes widened. That's him, she murmured. Dr. Greaves! Paul pointed to a section highlighted in red. These were payments made by a shell company tied to Howard's old real estate firm. One went to Greaves the week before your hearing. Layla's hands shook. Paul looked at her, voice low. He bought your diagnosis, and I am going to help you prove it. She stared at him, tears welling in her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from the shock of someone at long last believing her. You really mean that? She whispered. I do, Paul said simply, and I won't stop until we get your daughter back. Paul had never dealt with family court before, but he knew the smell of corruption when he encountered it. After securing the evidence of Dr. Greaves' connection to Howard, he wasted no time hiring a legal team with a reputation for dismantling dirty legal maneuvers. He explained the case to them in crisp, matter-of-fact sentences, hiding the fury bubbling underneath. This isn't just about a custody battle, he told them. It's about a woman stripped of her rights and a child kept from her mother through lies and power. The head of the firm, a composed woman named Elise Monroe, raised an eyebrow. If half of what you're saying is true, Mr. Blake, we're going to expose a very ugly mess. That's the plan, Paul said simply. Within days, the legal team began digging into the court records. What they found was worse than anyone had anticipated. The lawyer originally assigned to Layla's defense had suddenly withdrawn right before the custody hearing, replaced by a young associate who, records showed, had only passed the bar 3 months earlier. His defense was half-hearted, almost as if designed to fail. The transcripts revealed that Layla's objections during the hearing were dismissed without due consideration. The judge, an old acquaintance of Howard from law school, had rubber-stamped the psychiatric report without requesting a second opinion. It was never a fair fight, Elise concluded. She was never meant to win. When Layla heard the findings, she sat in stunned silence, her hand clasped over her mouth. All this time, she whispered, I thought maybe I'd done something wrong, maybe I'd acted too emotional. But it was all set up. Paul sat beside her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You didn't lose your daughter because you failed. You lost her because they cheated. And now, we fight back. The legal team also began reaching out to former staff members of Howard's household. Most refused to speak, but after a week of persistent digging, Paul's team found one name that stood out. Rosa Jimenez, a former live-in housekeeper who had left just a few months before the custody hearing. She agreed to meet, on one condition. I want protection, she told Elise over a secure phone line. He has friends in high places. I have 2 boys. I won't put them at risk." "Done," Elise assured her. "We'll file a confidentiality clause. You'll testify remotely, and your identity will be sealed." At the meeting, Rosa's voice trembled, but her memories were sharp. "He hit her," Rosa said, "more than once. I saw him push her down the stairs, then told the staff she was clumsy. She cried every night. He threatened her, said she'd never see her baby again." Layla's hands clenched tightly. "Thank you for speaking," she said. "You don't know what this means." Rosa's voice softened. "I remember you reading to your baby every morning. I remember the love. That's what stayed with me." The testimony was recorded, encrypted, and submitted as part of the appeal package Elise's team filed to the court. Alongside it were financial documents, transcripts, and the psychiatric fraud evidence tied to Dr. Greaves. Paul watched it all unfold, managing logistics, financing, and communications. But quietly, he was preparing something else. He had been tracking Howard's real estate dealings. One property caught his attention. A small home on the outskirts of town, up for discreet sale. The address was familiar. It had once belonged to Howard and Layla before the divorce. It was the home where Ava had taken her first steps. Paul purchased the house under a trust name, restored it with warmth, sunlight-colored curtains, fresh paint, a nursery room quietly refurbished. He said nothing to Layla. That evening, as the documents were submitted and the court set a hearing date for reopening the custody case, Paul walked out to the guest house, found Layla sitting under the stars, and handed her a key. "What's this?" she asked, puzzled. "A place of your own," he said. "A place to start again, safe, if things get difficult. No one knows I bought it, not even Howard." Layla stared at the key, silent. Paul's voice lowered. "Just a backup, just in case. You and Ava deserve a home that's yours." Her eyes filled with tears. She did not speak, but she stepped forward and hugged him, tight, long, and wordless, and in that moment something between them shifted. Not just trust, not just gratitude, but the start of something deeper, something unspoken. The courtroom was colder than Layla remembered, not because of the temperature, but because of the tension. This time, though, she was not alone. On her right sat Elise, calm and razor-sharp in her tailored navy suit. On her left, Paul Blake, his hand resting lightly on the table, a quiet signal of strength. The judge, an impartial replacement brought in from another county due to conflict of interest, called the hearing to order. "We are here to re-examine the custody ruling in the case of Layla Montgomery versus Howard Kane. New evidence has been presented that may significantly alter the original decision." Howard's team came in with fire. Their lead attorney stood confidently, delivering a statement that painted Layla as unstable, erratic, and manipulative. "Ms. Montgomery has a documented history of emotional volatility," the attorney began. "We submit that she is using these proceedings as a way to punish Mr. Kane, who has provided a stable, loving home for their daughter." Layla's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her gaze steady. She had heard these accusations before. She had lived with them. What she had not expected was the slideshow they produced. Photos of Layla looking disheveled during her hospitalization, medical notes doctored to suggest outbursts. They played recordings, taken without her consent, of her crying alone in her old home, manipulated out of context. Paul clenched his jaw. It was time. He stood up as Elise called him to the stand. After swearing in, he spoke calmly. "My name is Paul Blake. I'm a business owner, a single father of a 6-year-old boy. I have no previous connection to either party until 3 months ago, when I witnessed Mr. Kane physically assault Miss Montgomery in a public park and forcibly take her child." There was a rustle in the room. Even the judge leaned slightly forward. Paul continued. "I intervened. I brought her to the hospital. I saw the bruises. I heard her story. And what shocked me wasn't just the violence. It was the look in her eyes. The helplessness of someone who had screamed for help and never been heard." He then described the following weeks. The quiet resilience Layla showed, her care for his son Finn, her honesty. "She is not unstable. She is a mother stripped of her rights. I've seen her sing Ava's lullaby while looking at her photo. I've seen her make breakfast while wiping tears from her eyes. She's not dangerous. She's broken, but she's healing." When he finished, the room was still. Layla sat motionless, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The judge turned to Elise. "Ms. Monroe, do you have additional requests?" "Yes, Your Honor. We respectfully request an immediate forensic audit of the medical records submitted in the original custody hearing, and a review of any financial transactions between Dr. Greaves and Mr. Kane or his associates." Howard's team tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. Overruled. The judge leaned forward, voice clear and deliberate. "Until such investigations are complete, I am granting Ms. Montgomery supervised visitation rights, twice a week, effective immediately." Layla gasped. She clutched Elise's hand. Paul looked at her, smiling faintly. Howard stood frozen, his eyes locked on Layla, not with anger, but with the realization that his control was slipping. The judge concluded the session. "The court takes the integrity of family law seriously. If there has been manipulation, it will be uncovered. This is not over, but justice begins now." As people filtered out, Paul remained seated beside Layla. She turned to him. "You didn't have to speak like that," she whispered. He shrugged gently. "Yes, I did." She looked at him, long and searching, before whispering, "Thank you for seeing me." Paul didn't answer, he only nodded, because sometimes words were not enough. It was late afternoon when Paul asked Layla if she wanted to go for a drive. "Where?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her eyes still a little puffy from the emotional court session earlier that week. "You'll see," he said with a quiet smile. They drove in comfortable silence, Finn asleep in the back seat, the late sunlight washing everything in soft gold. Layla looked out the window, unsure of where they were headed until the streets started to look familiar. Her fingers tightened around the seatbelt. "Paul," she whispered. "This neighborhood." He glanced at her, then pulled into the driveway of a modest but charming brick house with white shutters and newly painted steps. The lawn was trimmed. Flowers bloomed in the front beds. There was a new mailbox. It was her old house. Her breath caught. "Why are we here?" Paul parked, turned off the engine, and turned to face her. "Because I want to show you something." He got out, came around to open her door. She followed him, hesitant, her heart pounding as they stepped onto the porch. The last time she had stood here, her hands were shaking for different reasons, trapped, silenced, watched. But now, the front door opened with ease. Inside it was unrecognizable. The dark, suffocating walls were repainted in warm earth tones. The heavy drapes were gone, replaced by sheer curtains that let in soft light. The living room smelled like sandalwood and lemon. A small piano sat in the corner, books lined the shelves, and a plush rug covered the once cold floor. Layla couldn't speak. "I bought it a few weeks ago," Paul said gently, standing a few feet behind her. "I didn't want to tell you until it was ready. I know this place has history for you, but I thought maybe we could give it a new one." She turned slowly, her eyes glistening. He motioned toward the hallway. "Come on, there's more." She followed him, her steps slow. He led her to the far bedroom, once the room Howard had locked her in during her worst nights. Now it was painted pale lavender. A small white bed sat against the wall, a stuffed rabbit propped up on the pillow. There were fairy lights strung along the headboard, a tiny bookshelf filled with picture books and colored pencils. Layla stared. "It's for Ava," Paul said softly. "For when she comes home." Layla turned to him, and something broke inside her. Not in pain, but in release. She took a trembling step forward and wrapped her arms around him, her face pressed against his chest. "Paul," she whispered, her voice cracking, "you don't know what this means. This house, this place, it was a prison, and now—" She pulled back slightly to look up at him. "Now, it's hope." Paul didn't speak. He only held her tighter. That evening, they returned to Paul's home. Layla made dinner, rosemary chicken, mashed potatoes, and steamed carrots, while Paul set the table and Finn excitedly colored a picture of a superhero family, insisting that the mom had magic powers. After dinner, they sat in the living room. Layla read to Finn while Paul cleaned up. Later, they all curled up to watch a movie. Finn nestled between them. Layla found herself laughing, really laughing for the first time in years. Later that night, when Finn had been tucked into bed and the house had grown quiet, Paul brought Layla a cup of chamomile tea. They sat on the porch, wrapped in light sweaters, the stars blinking gently above. "I don't know how to thank you," Layla said, voice hushed. "For everything." Paul looked at her, eyes warm. "You don't have to. I'm not doing it to be thanked." "Then why?" He hesitated for a moment. Then, softly, "Because I believe in you, and because no one, no woman, should have to rebuild her life alone." She stared at him, tears brimming again, but this time not from pain, from the beginnings of healing, from something that looked a lot like love. And from that night forward, Layla did not just exist beside Paul. She started to walk beside him, not as someone broken, but as someone choosing to rebuild, one moment of kindness at a time. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Layla walked in beside her attorney, her steps steady but her heart pounding. Paul followed behind them, calm and focused, a quiet force of support. The seats were filled with journalists, court officials, and a few curious onlookers who had followed the case closely ever since news of Howard Kane's misconduct had begun to surface. Across the aisle, Howard sat with his legal team, his jaw clenched, his eyes avoiding Layla's. Gone was the confident posture, the smug demeanor. In its place was a man cornered, watching the empire he built start to crumble. The judge entered and everyone stood. "Be seated," came the voice of authority that silenced the room. Layla's lawyer stood first. "Your Honor, we are submitting final pieces of evidence, documents, recordings, and sworn statements that confirm Mr. Howard Kane manipulated the legal and medical systems to gain sole custody of his daughter under false pretenses." She handed the bailiff a USB drive. The judge nodded for it to be played. The courtroom went still as the speakers crackled. Then came a familiar voice. "Dr. Emerson Greaves. I was approached by Mr. Kane. He said it was urgent that his wife was unwell. He offered a donation to the hospital if I helped document certain symptoms. Symptoms she never showed during our sessions." Layla closed her eyes as the words spilled out, her hands clenched on the table, knuckles white. The judge glanced down at the files in front of him. "You're saying this diagnosis was entirely fabricated?" Paul stood now. "I visited Dr. Greaves myself, Your Honor. I posed as a potential donor for the hospital. During our meeting, he admitted, without realizing he was being recorded, that he had never clinically diagnosed Layla, that what he wrote was at Howard Kane's request, in exchange for financial favors." Gasps echoed around the courtroom. Next, Elise introduced a sworn affidavit from the former housekeeper. "I saw Mr. Kane hit her. I heard her cry in that house more than I heard her speak. She wasn't unstable. She was trapped." The judge looked visibly disturbed. "Mr. Kane, do you have anything to say regarding these claims?" Howard's lawyer began to object, but Howard stood abruptly. "It's a lie, all of it. She's manipulating the court now. Enough." The judge's gavel struck once. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Kane." But Howard's composure had cracked. He kept muttering under his breath as his attorney tried to calm him. The mask was slipping. After a tense silence, the judge leaned forward. "Based on the overwhelming evidence and the credibility of the witnesses, the court finds that the previous custody ruling was made under fraudulent and unethical circumstances." Layla's breath caught in her throat. "Ava Kane is to be immediately placed under the primary custody of her mother." Layla rose. "Mr. Howard Kane is barred from contacting the child or the mother, directly or indirectly, until further review. A criminal investigation into the misuse of power, bribery, and falsification of documents will proceed immediately." The gavel struck again. It was done. Layla stared at the bench in stunned silence. Then her hands flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Her lawyer placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, but it was Paul who stepped closer, kneeling beside her chair. "You did it," he whispered. "No," she said, voice shaking. We did. Outside the courthouse, a light drizzle began to fall. The sky was gray, but Layla didn't feel its weight. Not anymore. As they reached the steps, a soft voice called out, "Mommy!" Layla turned just as Ava sprinted through the rain, arms wide, her curls bouncing. Layla dropped her bag and fell to her knees, catching her daughter in a trembling embrace. "I missed you so much," Ava cried into her shoulder. "They said I couldn't see you." "I'm here now, baby," Layla whispered into her hair, "and I'm not going anywhere." Behind them, Paul stood with Finn, who smiled as he watched Ava cling to her mom. Paul's gaze met Layla's as she stood, her daughter in her arms. "I don't know how to thank you," Layla said softly, walking toward him. "No one ever stood up for me like you did." "You didn't need saving," Paul said gently. "You just needed someone who saw you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Well, now I do. I see you, Paul." And under the quiet rain, with their children safe and close, something new began, not in a courtroom, not on paper, but in the warmth of two hearts learning to trust again. The days that followed were quieter, softer, filled with the kind of peace that Layla had forgotten was possible. She and Ava had moved into the guest wing of Paul's home, where sunlight spilled through the windows each morning, and laughter, real, unguarded laughter, bounced off the walls. Ava and Finn became inseparable within days, giggling over cartoons, building pillow forts, whispering secrets under the covers, like siblings born to the same rhythm of trust. Layla found herself watching Paul more closely now, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with quiet wonder. He was gentle with Finn, never raising his voice, always kneeling down to listen rather than towering to demand. In those moments, she saw not just a millionaire businessman, but a man who carried his own share of grief, who had chosen kindness despite it. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Paul suggested a picnic in the nearby forest trail, just the two of them. Layla hesitated, but Finn and Ava were happy to stay with Paul's sister for the day, and something inside her longed for the stillness of nature, the safety of open skies. They walked in silence for a while, the trail winding through golden leaves and whispering trees. Eventually, they found a small clearing near a slow-moving creek where Paul laid out a simple spread, sandwiches, apples, hot cider, and thermoses. As they sat on a blanket, Layla smiled, her eyes watching the light dance across the surface of the water. "When I was little," she said softly, "I used to dream of being a kindergarten teacher. I loved the idea of tiny chairs, story time, construction paper crafts." Paul turned to her, attentive. "What stopped you?" She looked down, her fingers brushing the rim of her cup. "Life. I got married too young. He said it was a silly dream, that I should stay home, and eventually, I believed him." Paul didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it sit, like a shared burden between them. Later that evening, when they returned home, Layla tucked Ava in and kissed her forehead. As she turned off the lamp, she heard Ava whisper, "Mommy, I like it here. Can we stay forever?" Layla's throat tightened. "We'll stay as long as we're wanted, baby." But she didn't know that Paul had already begun preparing something. Quietly, carefully, with the kind of intention that said more than words ever could, he had reached out to an architect, to local officials, and within weeks had begun the process of converting one of his unused properties into a community learning center, not just for Layla, but for mothers like her, women who had been dismissed, pushed aside, silenced. He named it after Layla's late mother, Elena's place. The day of the grand opening, Paul drove Layla to the location under the pretense of visiting a new project. When they arrived, she blinked in confusion, then awe. The building was simple but warm, with murals painted by local artists, child-sized bookshelves, and a garden of wildflowers out front. At the entrance stood a bronze plaque. Layla stepped closer to read, "For the mothers who have been broken, and the men strong enough to stand beside them." She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Paul stepped beside her, quiet but steady. "You once said you thought you had nothing left to give. But you give every day, Layla. To Ava, to Finn, to me." I wanted this place to remind you your dream never died. It was just waiting to come home." Tears welled in Layla's eyes, and without hesitation, she turned and threw her arms around Paul. For a moment they stood there, the world holding its breath. Then she pulled back, her voice shaking. "No one's ever seen me this way before." Paul smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." Their kiss was soft, no fanfare, no fireworks, just warmth, just truth. Just the beginning of something that neither of them had dared hope for, but had both been waiting for all along. 1 year had passed, and the world looked very different for all four of them. The house near the woods, once Paul's quiet retreat, had become a home in the truest sense. In the mornings, the sound of tiny feet echoed through the halls as Ava and Finn chased each other to the breakfast table. The air smelled of cinnamon toast and fresh coffee. There were finger paintings on the fridge, muddy shoes by the door, and soft lullabies hummed in the evenings as two children drifted to sleep under one roof. Paul and Layla had co-founded an organization called Mothers with Voice. It was more than a charity, it was a movement, a space where women who had once been silent found the courage to speak, to rebuild, to rise. Layla led with compassion, her story empowering others. Paul used his resources and network to build shelters, fund legal teams, and lobby for real policy change. Their days were full, courtroom visits, school pickups, late-night emails, but never too full for each other. In stolen quiet moments, they shared tea on the porch, whispered dreams beneath the stars, laughed over spilled juice and bedtime negotiations. One late afternoon, as a soft rain fell, Paul stood with Layla under the covered porch. The children were napping, the world hushed. "I used to dread rainy days," Layla said, hugging her sweater close. "They reminded me of when everything felt heavy." Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Then maybe it's time to rewrite what rainy days mean." Her breath caught. He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring. No diamonds, no flash. Just something warm, meaningful. "I don't want a perfect life," he said. "I want this life, with you, with our kids, with the chaos and the calm. Will you marry me, Layla?" She didn't speak at first, just nodded, eyes glistening with quiet joy. Then she whispered, "Yes, 1,000 times yes." That evening, they told the children over dinner. Finn gasped, clapped his hands. Ava smiled shyly and asked, "Does this mean we'll all have the same last name?" Paul chuckled, "Only if you want it, sweetheart." The house filled with laughter. Later that night, under the soft yellow glow of the dining room lamp, the four of them sat around the table. The meal was simple: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, peas. But it tasted like celebration. Finn spilled his juice. Ava giggled. Layla leaned her head against Paul's shoulder. On the wall behind them hung a framed photo. Taken just weeks earlier, it showed the four of them sitting on a picnic blanket. Finn's arm was around Ava, both grinning. Layla was mid-laugh. Paul had his arm around her, eyes soft, no shared blood. But everything else, hope, healing, choice, was theirs. Beneath the photo, in delicate lettering, a small plaque read, "We cannot change the past, but love and justice can rewrite the rest." And that was exactly what they had done. If this story stirred something deep within you, if it reminded you that love, justice, and quiet courage can rebuild what the world tries to break, then you are exactly where you belong. Here, at Soul Stirring Stories, we bring you tales that matter. Stories that lift the forgotten, speak for the voiceless, and remind us that even in the darkest moments, there is light, often found in the most unexpected places. If Layla and Paul's journey moved you, we invite you to like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories. Your support helps us continue telling stories that heal, inspire, and bring people together. Until next time, remember, even when the world says it's over, kindness can whisper, it's just beginning.